Welcome, everybody, to the Progress Texas Happy Hour. I don't know if anyone here is participating in a happy hour, but I have some water, and that's all I need to get elated. You're joining us now for our post-election analysis. You've heard all the wrong takes on all the other mediums. Now, hear the right take from Progress Texas. Probably the right takes from Progress Texas. The election happens at a number of levels. It happens at a national level, statewide level, and then local levels. So Wesley, there's all this confusion going on. What is happening at a national level in this election?
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of misinformation out there, as you mentioned. And so right off the bat, I think it's important to clear the air. The New York Times actually released a story this week in which they say they called election officials in every state, both Republican and Democrat, and all of them said that there's no evidence of voter fraud. So the Trump lawsuits that are happening right now are basically a Hail Mary, a last-ditch effort by the campaign, and they're all failing. DHS also is saying that the 2020 vote was the most secure vote in American history. So these conspiracies and lies are just a way for Trump and the Republicans who are backing him, some of them here in Texas, it's just a way for them to cast doubt on the results so that heading into the Biden presidency, our country is even more divided. But the fact is that Biden is the president-elect. He's beating Trump by 5 million popular votes, and he's beating him by a huge margin in the Electoral College. He's going to have a bigger lead over Biden's going to have a bigger lead over Trump than Trump had over Hillary Clinton in 2016 when it comes to the Electoral College. And then obviously when it comes to the popular vote too, because we all know he lost the popular vote in 2016. And so I think the takeaway from this is that it's obvious that this is all just a last-ditch attempt. It's going to fail. Trump would rather threaten our democracy for his ego than actually admit that he's a loser. But at the end of the day, that's what he is. He lost this election, so he needs to concede.
Can we also acknowledge that this was Trump's playbook the whole time? When he lost Iowa in the Republican primaries in 2016, he accused Ted Cruz of voter fraud. Oh, there's no way he could have possibly lost. Somebody had to steal it from him. And in fact, he started using the stealing line against Ted Cruz in the 2016 primaries. So it's just like a broken record at this point. I don't know how anyone can take him seriously.
And as you mentioned, Ted Cruz, it's actually sad because Ted Cruz is one of the people who's backing him in all of these conspiracies. So, yeah, it says a lot about Cruz.
Yeah, no surprise.
That's actually what I was going to say, too, that, Cruz, what a 180 from before Trump was president. Now he's just basically Trump's lapdog, which is not a very Texan thing to be. So it makes you wonder why he's still one of our two senators. So Wesley, I love that, kind of coverage of what's happening nationally. Texas also had a really interesting election night. Deanna, do you want to dive into that?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think we have to acknowledge that Texas was a competitive state this time around, battleground state. And what was really amazing was that we narrowed our margin to less than 6 points. And that's less than a bunch of other states that have been considered swing states for a really long time. So in this election, we have seen progress more than ever before. And one of those kinds of progress has been the fact that we have now our first woman of color vice president, which is just so exciting.
Yeah, and I got to say, I work a lot in the AAPI community here in Central Texas, and we were pretty excited to have a woman of Indian descent now as the second most powerful person in the world. I don't agree with her on everything, but just having her as a role model for young women and young men of all kinds to see we can do it too. Maybe I could be vice president one day too. You never know, but it's exciting.
Yeah, definitely. A strong woman of color, both of Indian descent and a Black woman. It's so amazing how many young brown girls can look up to someone in the White House. We've been waiting many years for that, and it's really great to finally see that.
I was listening to a podcast this morning, and it was the New York Times podcast called The Daily. And one of the things they talked about this moment is how not only can Kamala Harris be inspiring to young women and people of color, but to young men as well, because it normalizes women in power, and that we should be used to seeing that in our political institutions and in America, and that this is this can be an inspiring moment across the board, and it should be.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I totally agree with that too, especially because women of color came out voting Democratic the most out of all these demographics, and so to see not only that the vote of women of color is so powerful, the vote of Black women is so powerful as well. To see that reflected in leadership is so great, and something that we need to continue seeing as well.
Absolutely. And we just talked about, we started out talking about the overall national election. We dove down a little bit into Texas itself. Ed, I think it's also interesting to think about how do things play at congressional and state house levels?
Yeah, well, it was basically a tie, right? Like, no, Democrats ended up with a net gain of 0 seats in the Congress and in the legislature. The same for Republicans, a net gain of 0 in Congress and in the legislature from Texas. So what that tells us is a couple of things. One, it means that this election was about Trump and not much else. Anything else any other message that was attempted to deliver just didn't break through. So what voters did was they defaulted to their comfort zones and said, hey, we're just going to send back the people that have been representing us. And, the message there is we want you to work together. Now, whether that actually happens or not is another question. I think we're probably in for 2 years of gridlock in Washington, D.C. But, the message from the voters was, we want you all to work together. We'll see if that plays out. There's other elements to the stalemate as well, but from a 30,000-foot view, that's essentially what happened. There's one other important piece to acknowledge here, and it's that Democrats made significant gains in 2018, picked up 12 seats in the House, 2 seats in Congress. In 2016, Democrats also made gains. And in 2020, they were able to protect all of those gains. So having said that is a tall order no matter what state you're in, but particularly for the progressive movement in Texas. And, being able to hold on to those gains is something that is quite an accomplishment, and we should be able to revel in that. It shows resiliency of the progressive movement in Texas.
Couldn't agree more. Wesley, I think you had some thoughts around like how turnout played out in some of these areas like suburbs or rural areas or South Texas.
Yeah, so I'll just talk kind of generally about turnout first, because I think when we talk about progressive gains here, we have to mention the fact that despite a pandemic, despite the lack of vote by mail, despite all of the different ways that Texas Republicans tried to suppress the vote, Texas still had record-breaking turnout this year. We went from having one of the worst turnout rates to leading the country during early voting. Young voters and voters of color specifically turned out in unprecedented numbers here in our state. And as we mentioned earlier, the statewide margin narrowed in the presidential race. So we went from a 12-point margin in 2012 to a 9-point margin in 2016. And then this year we had a 6-point margin in the presidential race. And that's due to the efforts of different organizations that really worked on getting out the vote and registering people to vote.
Yeah, absolutely. And, the extra week of early vote didn't hurt. It was actually, that's when a lot of people went out to vote. And frankly, I'd love to see if these things that we changed in this pandemic, like extra week of early vote, if they stayed on, because, we need to make sure that every voter gets to vote. And it would make no sense to get rid of this great policy that we have. Yeah, go ahead, Ed.
I was going to say, I completely agree, Satvik. And I think now that our lawmakers have shown us that it's possible, there's no reason or really no excuse that they can give us for not doing it in the future.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And I also agree. I think those turnout numbers that you mentioned, Wesley, are so amazing, despite the fact that Republicans have continued in this election to do everything they could to suppress the vote. But definitely showed that Texans, no matter what is thrown our way, will fight to make sure that we can vote.
Absolutely. I think it'd be interesting for our audience if we dived into some of the, I guess, like nitty gritty, maybe. How did voters perform in the suburbs? How do they perform in rural areas? How do they perform in South Texas? Ed, I'm going to go to you. What do you think?
Yeah, so the bright spots are the blue counties, the major urban areas. So we're talking about Harris County, where Houston is, Bexar County with San Antonio, Travis County with Austin, Dallas County with Dallas, and El Paso County with also El Paso. Those being the biggest urban areas and the biggest blue areas performed really well. Democrats picked up an extra 600,000 votes out of those areas. Wow. Now, Republicans got 300,000 votes out of those areas. But the point is that, what Wesley was saying earlier is that turnout is just good for everybody. It's not necessarily good for Democrats or Republicans. It's good for democracy. And I think that for too many years, progressives and Democrats have looked at blue counties and said, oh, we're winning there anyway, we need to move on. But what we saw in 2020 was the organizations and campaigns doubling down on the blue areas and saying, okay, well, if we're winning here, let's run up the score. And Travis County alone turned out an extra 100,000 voters. Like I said, Harris County was an extra 600,000 voters. And you saw that across the board in the blue counties. So that's one area where it was a bright spot for progressives, Democrats, and liberals in this election. The other area, and I know that Diana's got opinions on this too, being in one of these counties, is that the suburban counties were effectively a tie. The Republicans used to have a distinct advantage in these areas, but that advantage has been neutralized. Democrats are basically even with Republicans in places like Tarrant County, which Democrats won, and in Williamson County, which Democrats also won, in Fort Bend County, and then, of course, Hays County as well. So those are the bright spots. There's some other areas that need some that we can talk about, but the good news is there. Diana, how did Hays County look different this year?
Hays County just blew everyone out of the water. I'm just going to brag about my home county. And I love that I'm bragging because for such a long time, Hays just looked so different when I grew up there. There were Confederate flags everywhere. There wasn't as much diversity as there is today. There weren't as much people, lots of cows. Back when I was a kid, I'd look out my front window and, see some cows going by. It's pretty cool. But it's changed drastically. The amount of folks that are turning out to vote. We're also a county with a university, Texas State University is there. So a lot of young voters as well that are so pumped and impassioned to turn out to vote and to see their county reflect their values. And it's not just the students, it's that Hays County has blown up in terms of population. A lot of towns that used to be really small towns, like my town, Kyle, the population has blown up and is one of the fastest growing towns in the entire country. And, the biggest point I want to brag about Hays County is that it was the very first county in Texas to exceed its 2016 turnout record. And that was amazing to see. I believe it might have been the first one in the country, maybe.
It was the first in America, yeah.
Oh, yeah. Wow. That was amazing. And so I'm going from telling folks to oh, I'm from Hays County, but it's under Travis. You might not know it, but now it's on the map. Watch out, Travis. So yeah, it's really great. It turned blue, like you mentioned, Ed. 2018 with especially with Rep. Zwiener being elected there and flipping that, and now it's just continuing to hold that line and to become even stronger.
And it's a similar story in places like Tarrant County, Williamson County, and even suburban counties like Denton and Collin, which still went Republican this year. But the strides that Democrats made in those areas are substantial, and they're really changing the face of those areas for the same reason, for everything that Diana mentioned. They're becoming more diverse. The population is growing. It's not just ethnic diversity; it's diversity of opinion. It's people who are able to, understand that there are two sides to a story. And I really like to use the word diversity of opinion as opposed to divided opinion, because as much as we're a divided country, I do think that we can come together. And the way we look at coming together is looking at as diversity of opinion.
So we're getting a question from Facebook from Beda Hernandez. Essentially, she doesn't understand how the Latino vote turned out as it did. And as we all know, the Latino vote in South Texas has gotten a lot of attention nationally as to what exactly happened. Diana, I feel like you talked about some insights you had earlier today. You mind chiming in? Yeah,
definitely. I'd love to talk about the Latino vote, and it's it's important to talk about, especially to counter this, false narrative that's being put in the media a lot, talking about Texas and Florida and how like Latinos delivered us to Trump. But what's very important to talk about first and foremost is that Biden won among Latinos in Texas. He won most of their votes. And another important thing to mention is that Latinos are not a monolith. Both Democrats and Republicans increased in numbers of the Latino vote this election season. However, Latinos still voted heavily Democratic. And it's important to know that the Latino vote, that community, it's a persuasion target. It's not a base target. We can't just assume that Latinos are going to vote Democratic. This is a community where we need to do the work and outreach to them. It's an audience that needs to be persuaded to vote Democrat. And, I think a lot of votes, especially nationally, are talking about the Rio Grande Valley and what that turnout looked like. But the numbers of Latinos that voted Democrat in the Rio Grande Valley, especially in Cameron, Hidalgo, Webb, and in another border county in El Paso, those numbers went up. But just as the number of voters went up for Democrats, they also went up in Republicans, but we still won there. We won the Latino vote in Texas. Like I said before, though, we're not a monolith. There's still a lot of work to do.
Yeah, and one of the things that Diana and I were talking about before we started here today was that we all have a Republican brother, right? Like it seems like everyone in the Latino community has a brother that votes Republican, and that's just kind of demonstrates the diversity of the community, diversity of thought. The community tends to vote 2-to-1 Democratic, which is different than, say, the Black community, which tends to vote 9-to-1 Democratic. So, there were some voters in these South Texas counties that turned out for Republicans who didn't vote in 2016. That's definitely something we've got to look at and spend some time on. But where this election was really lost in 2020 in Texas was in the small towns and rural communities around the state. They're already a high turnout population, those small towns and rural communities. And because they're so high turnout, it didn't seem that they could get any more votes out of their turnout than they did in years past, except that they did. They turned out another 400,000. And when you look at Trump's margin in Texas, which was just over 600,000, you can see that the lion's share of that lead came from these small town and rural communities, which is another area that we're going to have to look at and do some work on in the coming years.
One quick thing that I wanted to really highlight that Diana touched on is that a big takeaway when it comes to these smaller communities, but also across the state, a big takeaway from this election is that our messaging can't be limited to just during election season. It has to be ongoing. We need year-round investment in progressive infrastructure and in media in our state. And in addition to that, we really have to recognize what's happening on the Republican side of things. Republicans have created like this toxic media ecosystem, and we need to find a way to break through that and make sure that our messaging and our values are getting through to voters here in Texas. And I think that's one reason that Progress Texas, that's actually like the main reason that Progress Texas exists, is to do that work. And so while campaigns come and go, we're building that infrastructure here, and we need to continue. I've listened to quite a few interviews with Stacey Abrams over the last couple of weeks because a lot of folks have been talking to her and asking her, what did you do in Georgia? What helped turn Georgia blue? And it's this investment. It's not something that happens overnight. It's something that happens through years-long efforts, and it comes from organizations that are on the ground doing this work.
I couldn't have said it better myself, Wesley. And he's talking about messaging and investing. What we're doing right now is part of that. So if you want, and I think you should, there's a little share icon. So you should click on that. Share our post-election analysis with all your friends and family and community. You can copy and paste the link, drop it into an email, boom. All your Republican brothers and sisters, they can watch it and be like, man, we wrote it this time. We'll think about it for 2022. You can go to our website, www.progresstexas.org, subscribe to our email list so you can get all of this amazing insights on a weekly basis from Ed, Diana, Wesley. And then you can just follow along with what is going on in the state of Texas. Ed, Wesley, Diana, thank you so much. Do you have any last words before we sign off? I guess not. Oh,
No.
I think one last thing I would add is, echoing what Wesley's saying, is that we need to, continue to do the work and invest in these communities. We can't think, oh, maybe the election's over, it's done. No, people can still get registered to vote for, runoff elections, or as soon as you have a family member that turns 18, they can get registered to vote. We need to start doing that work around the clock, including right now, any time of the year.
Yeah, and actually that I do have one more thing to say. I was reminded when Diana was speaking is that elections can't be the beginning or end of our political involvement. It has to continue. Your activism between campaigns has to continue. And then, of course, the legislative session, which will be the next thing that we go to, which is going to really require a lot of input and a lot of your attention in the coming months.
Wesley, I'm going to go to you one last time since Ed and Diana had some good insights.
Yeah, one quick thing I'll add. I don't know how election related this is, but I want people going into the holiday season, be safe. Right now, COVID, we're seeing that there's a huge rise across the country. And so I think that's something that's going to be it's going to consume a lot of our lives the next few months. And thankfully, we have a Biden-Harris administration going into 2021 who's very much focused on this issue and who's trying to take us back to some semblance of normalcy. So I'm really looking forward to seeing what's going to happen with the cabinet and where we go from here with their administration in 2021.
So you heard it here. Stay safe and healthy. Make sure your friends and family register to vote. Make sure you pay attention to what's coming up next year with the ledge session. And maybe most importantly, don't forget to share this video to all your community, because we need to make sure that the message is getting out there. Thank you all so much for joining us today. We had a blast, and we'll see you soon. Have a good one.